Okay, hello once again. So I hope all of you understood what definitional theory is. Um, so basically, to recap what definitional theory is, it is a theory of meaning which tries to define, or to provide a definition for every concept, and it is based on this definition that any item is classified as belonging to a concept or outside of a concept. Okay. So the major disadvantages of this definitional theory that we saw was, first of all, coming up with definitions is very difficult, especially for abstract ideas. It is very difficult to come up with a satisfactory definition. Secondly, these definitions are supposed to have, very, what do you say, um, sharp boundaries, but in real life, often concepts are not very sharply presented like that. You can always look up or come across examples where it is difficult to uh, put it into a category or some other category, right? It cannot satisfy one category exactly. Okay, so that is the second disadvantage about this sharp boundaries of certain concepts or categories. The third disadvantage is that, according to the definitional theory, all the members of a particular concept, they will have the same status. For example, if you have a concept like animal, then all the animals inside that category will have the same status. So an elephant, a fox, a lion, a tiger, even something like a sea anemone, that will also have the same category, same status inside the category. You know, there is no privileging of one over the other. There is no centering of one category over the other. So because of all these disadvantages, you know, different other theories too have been proposed, and today we'll be discussing two of those theories: prototype theory and exemplar theory. Okay, all right. So one of the theories that has been put forward to overcome some of the limitations of definitional theory is called prototype theory, right? So the basic idea behind prototype theory is we are no longer going to look for a definition for a concept. Okay. So instead of a definition, we are going to create an ideal example of a concept. Okay. So if we are trying to define a concept like flower, we are going to imagine an ideal flower. Okay. It is not a real flower, it is not any particular flower as such, but we are trying to imagine an ideal flower which contains all the important characteristics that define that entire category called flowers. So for example, this ideal flower will have, you know, petals, colorful petals. It might be, very attractive in nature. It might contain honey or pollen. It might have a sweet smell, right? So like this, whatever thing that, whatever features that we usually associate with that category, they will all be present in the ideal example. So this ideal example is called a prototype. Okay. So this theory proposes that a concept is centered around a representation of an ideal example or prototype. So now that we have a prototype, how do we decide whether a particular thing belongs to the concept or not? So that is determined by how closely it resembles the prototype. Okay. So whether something belongs to a category is determined by how closely it resembles the prototype of that category. So whenever we come across a new object, we compare that new object to the prototype. And if it is resembling the prototype in many ways, if it is found to be very like the prototype, then we can decide to include it in our category. So for every new flower that we want to include in our category, we have to compare it with that ideal flower. So if it matches, you know, most of the concepts or many of the characteristics of that ideal prototype, we can include it in the category of flower. Okay. All right, so the prototype is represented by a set of features like we saw in the definitional theory. So just like that definition which we constructed for every concept in the first theory, definitional theory, here also for every prototype we need to have a kind of a list of features, you know. All right. All right, so let us look at an example of how something is defined in the prototype theory. Okay. So the concept of bird, okay, this is the concept that we are going to define using prototype theory, and it can be represented by the features: has feathers, has wings, flies, has two legs, lays eggs, builds a nest, sings, so on. Okay. So like this, we can list all the features that are associated with this category bird, right? And then this ideal prototypical bird, this ideal example of bird will have all of these features. Okay, so an ideal bird will have feathers, it will have wings, it can fly, it has two legs, it lays eggs, it builds a nest, it can sing, etc., etc., etc. We can, you know, we can have a long list of features that are associated with the concept bird. So this definition of the prototype is called the summary representation. Okay. So whenever we are giving this long list of features that are possessed by this prototype, that is called a summary representation. So what is a summary representation? It is a summary of all the features that are associated with that particular category. Okay. So based on the number of features shared with the prototype, the degree of resemblance to the prototype can be measured. Okay. So whenever we come across a new bird, what do? We compare it to this summary representation. So we try to understand how many of these features does this new bird have. Okay, does it satisfy 3 or 4 or 5 or 6? Like that, based on the degree of resemblance, we can identify this new example either as being a central example or a peripheral example. If it satisfies most of these categories, most of these features, then we can say that this new bird is there right in the center of this concept. It is a very central example. But if it is a bird like, let us say a penguin does not have feathers. A penguin cannot fly. So already, I don't think penguins can build nests either. So already these three features are not satisfied by the penguin. So that means that the penguin is not going to be situated in the center of this concept, but it will be, somewhere in the periphery, right? So here, one advantage of this prototype theory is that we can have examples that are graded. Certain examples will be more central, certain examples will be not as centrally located in a concept. So that kind of a distinction, that's a kind of a gradation, can be achieved in this prototype theory. Okay. All right. So in prototype theory, certain features that are there in the summary representation can be more important than other features. Okay, so we can mark the importance of certain features. For example, again, coming back to the category bird, it is very important that birds should have wings, right? So that have wings, that feature might be marked as a central feature. Similarly, lays eggs, that feature can also be marked as a central feature. But we can say, sings, that may not be a central feature of a bird, because not all birds can sing, right? Many birds are there which cannot sing beautifully, right? So that sings the feature which is called, the ability to sing, that can be marked as a, a peripheral feature. So even within, the features that are present in the summary representation, we can, we can identify certain features as central and others as peripheral. Okay. So based on this, we can differentiate between prototype theory and definitional theory. Okay. The first distinction is that the summary representation is not a definition. Okay. So in definitional theory, what was important is each concept should be associated with a, a very clear definition. But here the summary representation is not going to be a definition. It is simply a list of features. The features in summary representation are not individually necessary, right? Even if there is a bird who does not satisfy, 5 or 6 of the features in that summary representation, we can still include it in the category of bird. All right. But in the definitional theory, it is either in or out. If it satisfies the definition, it is inside the concept. If it doesn't satisfy the definition, it is outside. So that sort of a cut and dry distinction is not present in prototype theory. Okay. Only a sufficient resemblance to the prototype is needed as a condition of membership. So it is only necessary that there should be a sufficient resemblance, right? The new concept that we are trying to categorize, that we are evaluating it based on the resemblance to the summary representation. Okay. Now the next feature is, or the next point of comparison between definitional theory and prototype theory is, the boundaries of categories are fuzzy. That is, they can be, they can be porous. Okay. There is no sharp division between members and non-members. Okay. So that is something we cannot have in definitional theory, right? Here, because the summary representation is not to be followed to the letter, right? We don't need to satisfy all of the conditions in the summary representation. We can have a wider diversity of things which belong to a concept. Okay. Members of the category do not have equal status. Some members can be deemed central, others peripheral. We saw this. Two members of a category may resemble the prototype in different ways, and as a consequence may have little resemblance to one another. For example, in the concept of birds itself, we have a bird like a hummingbird. A hummingbird is a very small bird, right? And it is able to flap its wings very fast, and it is also able to fly forwards and backwards. Okay, so a hummingbird is an example of a bird which satisfies many of the conditions in the category of birds, right? But it is also not a typical bird because it is very small. Hummingbird is supposed to be the smallest bird. So it is not a very typical example, but it can still be included in the category. Similarly, let us take a very large bird such as an ostrich, right? An ostrich can also be included in the category because it satisfies many of the conditions. Why? Because it has 2 legs, it has feathers, it has wings, it lays eggs, it has a beak, etc. So all these features are satisfied by the ostrich, so it belongs to the category. But when we compare a hummingbird and an ostrich together, the difference between both of these things are very great. It is almost as if they don't belong in the same category together. On first, just looking at a hummingbird and a ostrich, we might feel it is not right to put these two things together into a single category. But prototype theory is in such a way that even if the individual members of a category do not resemble each other, they can still belong to the category together because they resemble the prototype in different ways. Okay, so that is an advantage, let us see, of prototype theory. Okay, so now that we have looked at 2 different theories of meaning, definitional theory and prototype theory, We have now come to the third theory of meaning, which is called exemplar theory of meaning. Now, this theory of meaning is a little different from definitional theory and prototype theory. Here, we are not going to look at what do you say, definitions, or we are not going to construct ideal example of a category. Instead, exemplar theory is, it builds on the kind of examples that we encounter in our day-to-day experience. Okay, so this is a theory which tells us that our idea of concepts is something that is gradually acquired through experience. So how does it work? Let us take the concept of flower that we have been discussing right from the beginning. Every time we encounter a flower in day-to-day life, maybe as a child, the first time that you are encountering a flower is maybe you are along with your parents and you see something and you ask them, dad or mom, what is this? And they tell you, this is a rose, this is a flower. Okay, so at that time you identify the concept flower with that rose. Okay, because that is the only example of flower that you have experienced. Okay, so then you come back home, let us say, and you are looking through a book and you see another thing, it is a lotus flower. So you take that book to your father or your mother and you ask them, father or mom or dad, what is this? And your dad might say, this is also a flower. Okay, so you might feel confused. Oh, but father, you said that a flower is, red like a rose. It has thorns and everything, but this doesn't have anything like that. So your father will say this is also a flower because, flowers can also have, not have thorns, and it can also have many petals, and it can also, bloom in a pond or in water. Okay. So now you have added one more example to, the concept of flowers. Right. So now you have two examples, a rose and a lotus. So the third time you encounter something similar, maybe you see, you are walking in the garden and you see a jasmine, right? So in your mind, you already have these two examples, and now you start to compare, right? Even if your parent is not there with you, you think, oh, this satisfies, this looks like a lotus in some ways, but it is a different color, and it is also like a rose because the color is, I mean the it is not there in water, it is, on a tree, or it is blooming in a flower pot, right? So based on those two concepts, you can successfully categorize this new jasmine flower as a flower. Okay, so that is how exemplar theory works. It works by taking already existing examples that you have in your mind, and then whenever you encounter a new thing, you try to categorize it according to all the examples that you have already experienced. So this is exemplar theory. So there is no definition involved, there is no prototype involved. It is just kind of comparison between already existing information and new information. Okay. All right. So in exemplar theory, each concept is presented as a collection of memory traces of individual examples. Okay. So things that are there in your memory, things that you have experienced, through, through your encounters with various concepts. That is what exemplar theory consists of. Centrality of a new idea is based on the similarity to stored concepts. Okay. So if a new flower that you are encountering is similar to both the rose and the lotus, then you will categorize that as a central thing, right? But if you encounter a flower like, let us say, what will be a very strange flower, let us say orchid, right? An orchid which is growing on a tree. We know that orchids are like parasitic in nature, right? They don't grow, they can grow on tree trunks as well. So suppose you are encountering this orchid. You have already encountered a rose and a lotus. Maybe you have already encountered a jasmine also. But this orchid is different from all of those things in many ways. So you will categorize that orchid as a peripheral example of a flower. You will still successfully categorize it as a flower because the resemblance is there. But you will be able to place that flower in the appropriate section, right? Central or peripheral. So this exemplar theory is as successful as prototype theory, right? So we find that there are no real, problems with this exemplar theory, and maybe this is actually how the mind organizes things. Right? You should remember that all of these theories are, theories. We don't really have, exact experimental proof for any of these things, because the way the mind processes meaning is still a very difficult to understand thing, right? We cannot really look into how the mind is working. Okay, so this has all the advantages that prototype theory has over definitional theory. In addition to that, it also has some advantages over prototype theory. For example, it can account for atypical members. Okay, atypical members means strange members of a concept. Look at the first example of an atypical member of a concept. So suppose you are trying to identify animals as a concept. Your parent is trying to tell you about animals, and maybe your parent has already told you, okay, see, an animal is always something which has four legs, something which walks around, which moves all the time, um, and something like that. If that is how your parent has told you what an animal is, suppose you see a three-legged dog that does not bark, right? We can still identify it as an animal, but it doesn't have four legs. It has only three legs. And even though we know the concept of a dog, it doesn't have the usual characteristic of a dog. It does not bark. But still, because exemplar theory has given us, all these previous examples, we can still identify this atypical member through its resemblance, right? So this is a more, what do you say, subjective evaluation. This is you yourself who is evaluating. So when you see a three-legged dog that does not bark, you yourself evaluate it with all the other animals that you have encountered in your life, and you say that this is not a strange thing. This is just a dog. So like that, a penguin can also be very easily accounted because the resemblance is based on all the other birds that you have seen, and a penguin does resemble many of the other kinds of birds. And it's very easy to then categorize penguin as a bird. Alright, so definitional theory, prototype theory, and exemplar theory. These are the three main theories of meaning that you have to know in semantics. So we have come to the end of that section. Now, there are still a few more concepts in semantics that needs to be discussed. These are componential analysis, then the definitions of what a reference and sense are, what is implication, what is entailment, and presupposition. So these are the remaining ideas in semantics, and we will discuss that in the next class.